Missed an episode of your favorite podcast? Choose from over a decade of content in our archives, not just the latest episode. All free at gcnlive.com.
This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@USAPrepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Everyone all set? Cocked? Locked? Here we go. Your dial is set correctly to USA Prepares. We're delighted you're with us in class this morning. I'm Vincent Finelli. Patrick is engineering the broadcast in Minnesota. And if you'd like to call us, we'll pay for the call. 866-582-9933, 866-582-9933. Telephone listen line, it's delayed, but it's working. Not the one we've been using. This is a different one. And it's delayed about an hour. So if you want to follow along, an hour delayed, here's the number. 701-719-0914. 701-719-0914. Guineith Isaacs is with us in Australia. Welcome, Guineith.
Hello, Vincent. How are you this morning?
Guineith, I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you for asking. And you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm just waking up at the moment, though. I've noticed listening to some of the recordings of myself, I can sound a bit slurred for the first little while of the broadcast sometimes. And people have to be aware that it's just after 2 a.m. in the morning here, and I've generally only just woken up.
Yeah, well, Guineith, generally speaking, I don't think your speech is slower for more than 2 hours.
I generally wake up pretty quickly.
No, I'm just
talking.
Kidding. Oh, yeah, I'm just kidding, of course. Guineith, you know, one of the things that I've noticed over my 65-plus years is the same thing that you've mentioned in an email to me. And when I was going to elementary school, I had a classmate, and his parents owned a small company that operated in space that was maybe the size of a 2 or 3 car garage. And it was a building that was on their small farm on the East Coast. And it was a tool and die making company. This small company, maybe, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 employees at the most, probably fewer than 5, made the tools, made the dies that allowed us to make products. Well, if you look around, I don't see very many tool and die companies anymore. They had the machinery, the lathes and the mills and, those kinds of machines. And they had the people, we'll call them engineers, who had knowledge about how to measure what materials were soft, which materials were harder, which materials could be bent and shaped and drawn, and which materials were malleable, which were brittle. They knew these things, and they could make the parts that were used to make other machines. So let me give you an example. Here in Missouri, we have a company.
Tool shop.
Yes.
Yep.
Here in Missouri, there's a company that is still in business, but I see very, very few of these kinds of companies. But they make parts for the forming of other parts. They make like the dies. They make the dies that go into presses. So, for example, if you want a Bosch electric dishwasher, it has a front panel which is formed out of maybe stainless steel or some other kind of metal, and it is formed into a specific shape with specific bends and holes in it for for attaching that panel to the front of a dishwasher. Well, they make the parts that allow those front panels to be manufactured out of steel. But those companies are going away. And as you see those companies go away, obviously what follows next is the manufacturers of the front panels and the other parts of machines that we make going away as well. And it's kind of it's very, very sad. And it's very, very frightening if you consider the prospects when the small tool and die manufacturers go out of business. Those are my thoughts. Yeah,
I would absolutely agree. And when I emailed you, I think I was talking about my dad, who was
yes, you were.
Not just an engineer, he was a master engineer, okay?
Mm-hmm.
He was trained to be an engineer by his uncle, who was Cyril Carter, who was, at that time, he was the managing director of the Midland Junction Railway Workshops in Perth. And so he oversaw the whole operation of the basically Perth's West Australia's locomotive manufacturing industry that they had. And it's a really, really sad thing when an amazing, massive factory like that becomes a museum. That's exactly what's happened to the Midland Railway Workshops now. And they used to manufacture locomotives. And that's what my dad did for his apprenticeship. He was trained as a locomotive engineer. That meant that he had to know every aspect of engineering, from drafting to boiler making to welding to fitting and turning. He had to know the lot. The only thing he didn't have to know, and the only thing he never learned as an engineer, was electronics. But yeah, he was certified as a boiler maker. He was certified as a welder. He was certified as a fitter turner. He was certified as a machine tool manufacturer. He knew it all, except for electronics. Uncle Cyril knew electronics and electrical engineering. And in fact, Uncle Cyril basically designed and commissioned, and probably some of it would have actually manufactured himself, the first electrical grid of Perth in Western Australia. And he was responsible, Uncle Cyril, that's my dad's uncle, my granddad's brother, was responsible for building all the machinery, some of it actually physically himself, much of it he was the overseer of the East Perth Power Station and the Kwinana Power Station. And I asked him one day, I said, Uncle Cyril, does that mean that you built the East Perth Power Station? And he said, I didn't make the buildings. In other words, he was really responsible for designing, manufacturing, in that he ordered the parts, he hired the laborers who made the machinery and all of that. That was Uncle Cyril. And God bless his soul, he passed away a number of years ago. I think he passed away around about 2006. But that's a very, very great loss to the world. But once again, he knew more than my dad. My dad was an absolutely amazing engineer, but Uncle Cyril, who was the generation before him, was better than him. You know what I mean?
Do you think that Uncle Cyril had in his mind when he was building the East Perth in Australia power station? Do you think he was thinking, here's a great way that we can rip off our customers, we can manipulate them, do you think he had that in his mind, or do you think that he would rebel at that?
Absolutely not.
Right. And I couldn't imagine.
He was somebody who wanted to build something great for the benefit of humanity.
Mm-hmm. Here's why I asked that. Dr. Richard Allen Miller is, of course, a senior instructor here at USA Prepares. And he built a number of machines, if you will. And he designed a number of systems and processes. And I did, a few years after him, same kind of thing. Built some systems, designed some systems, implemented some systems. And he and I, and I'm sure Uncle Cyril, all felt that we were doing the right thing for humanity. We were doing the right thing for the business that employed us, to help make everything better for everybody. Our customers, our employees, the financial stability of our organization, all those things. However, later on, we learned that other people at higher levels were using the technology that we built for enriching themselves at the benefit of the little people, meaning the customers. But we had no idea that they would be using these systems to control and manipulate. So as Uncle Cyril built the grid was, the platform for surveillance today, which he probably had no idea.
He had no idea at the time about anything like government surveillance. When he was a very, very old man, he lived to be about 96 years old. And like I say, he died in about 2006. He was born in 1910. 1908 or 1910 or something. So he'd been about 96 or 98 years old when he died.
What a loss. Guineith Isaacs is with us. We'll be right back. Guineith, we were talking about systems that were built, we'll talk about maybe in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and how they're being used by the government to monitor what we do. And I've been thinking, what is the term that would best describe government employees and their handlers? And the term that I've come up with, it's not my term, but it certainly is applicable to these government employees, and I believe at all levels. Starting with the secretary, the receptionist, moving on up to middle management through the upper levels. And the term is peeping Toms. The people who, look into other people's windows, look into their bathroom windows to get a peek of someone in the shower. People who look in bedrooms. People who have binoculars and look at, women bathing, in swimming pools and so forth. And people who want to spy, know more about, invade. And that's the term that I think is applicable to government employees and their handlers, peeping Toms. Is there anything that these people do that does not interfere with our lives? Is there anything that government doesn't do? Now, for example, I got a notice from the government that I needed to re-register one of our vehicles, okay, and that I needed to pay another tax in order to keep the vehicle that I already bought and paid for, own free and clear, almost, except for the fact that they keep taxing me on it. If they didn't tax me on it, I would own it free and clear. But I have this personal property that the state of Missouri demands that I pay a rent on. So, for example, they want me to pay rent on cows that I own every year. So
Really?
I bought the cows. I paid for the cows.
Right.
That's right. That's what they want.
They're your cows.
Yes. Well, here's what they do.
Tax per head of cattle.
Correct.
No wonder your farming industry is going broke.
Yes. Yes. There's a tax on livestock. There's a tax. Now, this is an annual tax. So let's say I buy a mama cow and I buy a bull, and they mate and they have a calf. Well, I had to pay a tax on the mama cow to keep the cow, a tax on the bull to keep the bull, and then a tax on the calf to keep the calf. Now, what these parasites do, these peeping toms, what they do is they count the number of head that you have. And different cows are...
They don't send a car around to your paddock to stand at the corner of your paddock and count your cows, do they?
Well, no, they have... Well, I have a feeling that they're going to use drones and satellite imagery for that, because I looked at a satellite image of our farm, and there they are. There are the cows standing in the field. And you can count them. You can count these little black dots that kind of look like they're oblong dots.
That's just obscene. My jaw's literally hanging open.
Yeah.
That's obscene.
Yeah. Well, and you have some of these government feeding at the trough peeping Tom parasites who work for the system that requires everyone pay their tax or else at the muzzle of a gun, that kind of a thing. Well, some of these people, we find out, don't report the correct number. They seem to forget most of their herd. Okay, that's one thing. Well, we have people who are in the...
twice.
Excuse me?
They count some cows twice.
I'm sure they do.
That's a cow, or that's another cow pointing to the first cow again.
Yes, yes. I'm sure they do that.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff that our government, G-men, G-women, peeping Tom, blue team, those people do.
And then they tax the hamburgers too.
Yeah, and the hamburger makers, and the hamburger machines, and the materials that go into the hamburger machines. Yeah, you're right. Let's reconnect. Patrick, would you reconnect? It sounds like Guineith has some dropouts. So, Guineith, I was thinking about this tax, and since you brought it up, you know, if we want to manufacture a part in the United States, so let's say the part has some steel in it. Well, there's an employee tax on the miners who mine the iron ore. There's a tax on the mining corporation. Then there's a tax on the vehicles that the employees use to travel back and forth to work, and a tax on the tires, and a tax on the gasoline, and a tax on all the repair parts and maintenance parts to keep these vehicles running. Then the trucks and equipment that mine the iron ore have all kinds of taxes on them, and then there's another tax on the haulers that haul the once the ingots are manufactured, there's a tax on the ingot manufacturing process, and the employees, and the vehicles, and the tires, and the gasoline, and the diesel, and the electricity, and so forth, and it keeps going like that. So I'll bet you, just in rough numbers, I'll bet you there are about 50 separate taxes at least on every finished product that we buy. At least 50 different taxes have been paid to the point where you get to buy it and then pay sales tax on it. I believe that's true.
Well, you know something? It's like this. It's a matter of attitude. In Uncle Cyril's generation, okay, now he was a senior government bureaucrat. He was one of the most senior bureaucrats in the state. He did not see his job as being one of taxation. He saw his job as being a vital part in making a better world. Okay? Managed and directed the Midland Railway Workshops as one of his major jobs. But that's not the only thing he did. He also had to oversee the electrical infrastructure, the water supply for the whole state. He was responsible for employing and providing work for a vast number of people. The state engineers was one of the biggest employers in the whole state. They had a workforce of thousands, and they manufactured anything that the state had to do with engineering. So railway lines, water supplies, electrical lines, you name it. Okay, if it was an infrastructure of the whole state, and including government buildings. The state engineers were the ones who put together government buildings. And if you look at some of the earlier government buildings in Western Australia, they were things of beauty. Or I'm sure in any part of the world, they weren't these foul, I think James Howard Kunstler calls them DVD players. They seem to invest their landscape now, like, for instance, the Boston Town Hall. It's a prime example. If anyone wants to go onto the internet and type in Boston's Town Hall, they will see a gigantic brown square block that, the architects who designed that building forgot one little detail in that building, and that is that buildings need windows. It doesn't have any. It's a big brick brown square that someone's dropped into the middle of the landscape. It's disgusting, and it's got two holes at the front, one for the people to go in and for the other one for the people to come out. It's disgusting.
I'm looking at it right now.
My uncle and the bureaucrats of his generation generally did not see their jobs as being taxation. They saw their jobs as being the ones who were responsible for building a better world. When it became about taxation, I think that the world really, really took a turn for the worst. The world wasn't always like this. Yeah. It's disgusting, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think the difference, as you were saying this, I jotted down a note. As you were saying this, I think the difference is, previously we were talking about infrastructure building, where people were physically constructing things. And now government has become more of an enforcing tool, and enforcing rules, typing in data, collecting data, spying to collect even more data, storing data, withdrawing data, using data against the people who pay the bills, and that kind of thing. And I was talking with someone yesterday about my visit to Lowe's and how I was behind a person who received a 10% discount because he was in the military. And I objected to that. I objected to the fact that he got a discount because he's in the military. And I said, what about fat people? What about the handicapped? What about the blind? Don't they get a discount? No, they don't. What about the people? And I said, now, military, aren't those the people who blow things up? That's what we're talking about, right? Those guys? So we're giving them a discount for blowing things up? I said, what about the people who pay for the military to blow things up? Do they get a discount? I mean, they call them taxpayers. Do they get a discount? She said, no. I said, so you only give discounts to people who blow things up. And she was annoyed with me. Now, I think it's wonderful to be in the military. My dad was, and my uncles were, my grandfather was, and they fought because our country was attacked. I think it's important to have a military defense because there are bad people all over the world. I understand that. But I don't think we need to go and attack sovereign nations because they've got, they've got titanium, they've got nickel, they've got materials, elements that we want, so we go and destroy their infrastructure, and then we call it things like Iraqi freedom. We go and blow them up, and we call it Iraqi freedom. Heck, the last thing I want is someone to come with bombers and missiles and rockets and mortars and howitzers and infantry to give me freedom. That's the last thing I want, to destroy our infrastructure and then say, you owe us a debt of gratitude, thank us very much for destroying your water supply, power supply, buildings, roads, and polluting everything around you, and causing birth defects for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
I really don't want that.
It's like this. Both of my grandfathers were actually in active military service during World War One, and one of my grandfathers, that was Harold Carter. That was Cyril Carter's brother, and he went off to World War One. He couldn't quite remember his birthday properly. And I think he thought that he was a year or two older than he thought he was. And,
that's what happened. That's what happened back then.
That's what happened back then. And
yes.
He basically said to his mother, "Listen, Mum, they've announced that they've got a war happening. I'm going off to war." And she said, "I don't agree." And to be fair enough, her husband, his father, had died not long before. He got tuberculosis and he died. So she was recently widowed, and then she gets the word that her son wants to go to war. And he's all of about 16 years old and thinks he's a man, and he pretty well was. Back in those days, a 16-year-old was definitely a man, but she was sort of... And he said, "Well, listen, if you don't let me go, I'm going to enlist under a false name, and you'll never know what happened to me." And so his mother relented and ended up signing and saying, "Well, yes, I approve of my son going into the military." And in those days, if you had your parents' approval, you could go into the military at the age of 16 and go into active service. But what happened, he went to the Somme. They were actually going to war against a really, really, really evil man who was the Kaiser Wilhelm. Okay? And Kaiser Wilhelm was the first cousin of Queen Victoria. But do you know what Queen Victoria's opinion was of the Kaiser? Her opinion of Kaiser Wilhelm, her first cousin, was, this is a really, really evil man. And at some stage, we're going to have a war against him. Okay? That was Queen Victoria. And this was 8 years after Queen Victoria died. That war actually happened. And she watched with a lot of grief of watching what the Kaiser was doing to his own country, of how he was becoming a despotic little so-and-so. But, that was one grandfather. He ended up at the Battle of the Somme, and he was at the Battle of the Somme for many, 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 many years. But the other grandfather, who was my mother's father, he was in the mopping up campaign in Belgium after World War One. And you know something? He was in the household cavalry, and I think I was speaking with you earlier about what the household cavalry is and was at the time. They would spend about half their time, and this is still how it is to this day, about half their time guarding the royal palaces in and around London, especially Buckingham Palace, and they spent the other half of their time on deployment in places around the world. And there's a big overlap between the household cavalry and the Royal British Army Corps of Engineers. And, Pop spent a lot of his time putting things back together after World War One.
Let's talk more about that when we come back. We're talking about World War One, and class, just to give you a perspective, There were more than 41 million military and civilian casualties in World War I. More than 18 million died. 18 million died and 23 million wounded. And it was one of the most deadly conflicts in human history. It wasn't the most, but it was one of the most deadly conflicts in human history. I just wanted to share that. So, Guineith, you were talking about Pop, as you called him, putting things back together after World War I.
That's right, yeah. And he was, when he wasn't on guard duty at Buckingham Palace, riding a big black horse, wearing a big brass helmet in the household cavalry with the big blonde ponytail coming out the top. And if anyone's familiar with British culture, they've probably got a picture on the inside of them of what he looked like. The uniform hasn't basically changed in probably several hundred years. But that was my pop's job. And as well as that, he was an engineer. He wasn't as good an engineer as my dad, in my humble opinion, although he would probably beg to differ. But he was certainly good enough for what he needed to do. And the thing about both Pop, that's Mum's dad, and my dad, was that both of them were also master horsemen. Okay? Pop was a graduate of Sandhurst Military Academy, which is like the UK's answer to West Point. And the Household Cavalry is one of the most elite units in the British Army to this day. And it's a very, very, very proud military heritage, both in active service and also as the importance of their role in guarding the British royal family. You know, but the other thing is that he was a rail engineer, and that was his specialist area. And the thing about a railway engineer in the military, you have to be good at two things, okay? You have to be very, very good at blowing things up. You have to be very, very good at putting them back together. Because part of being a rail engineer in the military is knowing how to attack the enemy's railway lines. And that's where the blowing things up happens. And part of putting them back together is when you have captured the railway line, you need to rebuild it. And that was, I think that's because the fighting, by the time my pop came into military service, the fighting had more or less, the worst of it was over in Belgium at the time. So he was more into putting things back together, but he did have his blasting ticket, as did my dad, who was, he was never in active military service, my dad. But nevertheless, he was, as part of his engineering training, he got his blasting ticket. And, you know, you've got to realize that these guys, they knew how to use explosives, but they used it for a good and right and peaceful purpose, okay, in their everyday lives. You know, even though Pop was trained in the military in the use of explosives in the British Army, you know, in his ordinary life of being a railway engineer, he would just use it in the process of doing things like, you know, maintaining the railway line. You've got to set signals sometimes on a railway line by setting small charges that let people know when there's maintenance being done on the track. You lay a small charge on the track that the oncoming train detonates, and it lets people know down the track. It doesn't derail the train, but it lets people know down the track that there's a train coming. And this sort of thing, you know. But anyway, we'll get on to what we're going to say probably after the news. I think this is the top of the hour, isn't it?
It is. Hour number 2 of USAPrepares.com. Guineith is off-grid in Australia. I'm broadcasting off-grid in Missouri, United States of America. I believe that USA Prepares is the first transcontinental off-grid broadcast. I believe we are.
Yep. Yeah, well, I reckon you're probably right. And, you know, something that the infrastructure around here, people might be wondering what the point is here. Talking about these two men, both of them have passed on now, okay? The thing is, both of these men were very, very competent engineers. They could do everything from shoeing a horse to building a house to maintaining a rail line to, you know, just about doing anything. And certainly, if the country had been threatened militarily, okay, they would have had enough know-how in things like gunsmithing and blasting to engage in an effective, and military tactics to engage in an effective military campaign. And they were both very, very well-read men. Men like that today are almost unheard of. I can't see them except a few in the older generation. I can't see them. And the ones that I can see are, you know, that they're mostly old men, probably north of 70. They really are literally, very, very sadly, a dying breed. And both Pop and Dad would have been capable of manufacturing machine tools. They could have run, although Pop less so, because Pop was unfortunately afflicted with alcoholism. But he had the British Army rule of alcohol management in that, you know, you did what you liked when you were on leave, but you turned up to your post sober. And for that reason, he managed to always hold down a job, you know. But unfortunately, he was alcoholic, and that really, it was the death of him in the end. He ended up getting cirrhosis and dying. But he could shoot his own horses. He could break his own horses. He knew all about harness, and he knew all about gunsmithing, and he knew about artillery, and he knew about munitions, and he knew about rail lines, water supplies, probably not so much electrical supplies. But, you know, if the world had fallen to pieces in Dad's time and Pop's time, between the two of them, they could have put it back together again. I can't see anybody out there who knows how to do that now. And, you know, I don't think there would be anybody like that around where you are either, would there, Vincent?
Well, you know, I was thinking about some of these things, and I was thinking about a job I used to have, and I worked for 3 banks, and I was probably one of the very few people who had a job at the bank who did not have a job description that's, you know, that was very precise. My job description was do whatever it takes. It was kind of unwritten. And it kind of sounds like what you're talking about. We don't have a lot of people in this country, as you've mentioned, who are jacks of all trades. And the saying used to be jack of all, master of none, meaning he knew a little bit, but not a lot about, you know, many things. And I was thinking, as you were saying that, we had a little get-together here at the farm. And I was showing our little Thanksgiving guests, our group of Thanksgiving guests at the farm, some of the farm that they hadn't seen. And they were amazed at the solar system that we built. And I'm not bragging, but here's what I'm trying to make this point. They were surprised that I was able to design, fabricate, cut, weld do the concrete work, all of the fabrication that was necessary. Mrs. Finelli was involved. Our son was involved. All of us were involved in doing something we had never done before to build this complete system that's operational. They were surprised that we could do that without any help. And I wasn't surprised. I asked Mrs. Finelli, I said, so are you surprised? And she said, no. And I thought, wow, I thought this was a pretty neat thing that we built, and you're not surprised that we were able to pull this off? She said, no, I knew we could do this. But it takes a willingness to undertake something that maybe you haven't done before, and the persistence to succeed. That's what it takes. The drive to start it, the drive to continue, the drive to finish it, and the drive to make it ever better along the way. And I see that is something that is lacking in today's educational system. I see that's something that is lacking, not in all young people, but too many young people. They're just satisfied to go along, to get along. And I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to go along if I think it's wrong. If I think it's wrong, I'm going to say something, or I'm going to go and do it independently on my own. That's kind of how I feel about that. And one of the things that you mentioned in your email to me was hobbies. Heck, what happened to hobbies? Yeah. You know, there were years ago, you could buy parts at the electronics store on the corner in the nearby city. You could buy the capacitors, the resistors, the chokes, the transformers, the wire, the solder, the etching materials to make circuit boards. You could buy the tubes, the transistors, the integrated circuits. You could buy all those things. You could
and make your own circuit.
Right. Read a magazine or a periodical or an article on how to do things. You could try it, improve on it based on what you've learned before that and before that and before that and after that, and make things better. We used to encourage hobbies. We don't encourage hobbies anymore, unless it's something to do with a keyboard and a screen and a mouse. But where are the people who used to love to refinish furniture? Who knows how to refinish furniture?
That was one of my dad's hobbies. He would restore antiques, and he would also that got him into furniture making. Mm-hmm. And he used to make furniture out of, for instance, at one time he had an old oak wardrobe that was kind of decayed as a wardrobe, and I probably didn't help Matt as much when I was a teenager. I turned it into a bird aviary. Much to Dad's horror, because I drilled holes in the side of these beautiful, big, like 18-inch wide oak panels. Mm-hmm. I didn't know it was oak. Mm-hmm. But anyway, he was able to salvage enough wood out of it to make a nested set of oak tables. Mm-hmm. And they were beautiful. And, people would say, well, why did you do that? And he said, for the joy of making something.
Sure.
Just for the joy of it.
Mm-hmm.
And,
right after...
where are the people who make oak tables out of old wardrobes just for the joy of having something beautiful in the house?
Mm-hmm. Very, very few. I mentioned to my wife during the last break that I hope that our son would be able to pick up a couple pieces of wood. I'm building a bookshelf. Well, actually, it's a built-in bookcase, if you will. I'm going to build that right after this broadcast. And that's my plan. I should be able to have it all done by today. And it can be painted, whenever the weather is right. But that's the plan. And I just cannot sit still. It bothers me. And it's very sad that people today, young people, don't seem interested in having hobbies. My generation, You could buy a model airplane, a model ship, model cars, and you'd glue them together and kind of see how these pieces and panels would go together. You could buy a little steam engine. You could buy an electronics kit. You could make a radio, an amplifier, a transmitter. You could learn how to build a speaker box, meaning out of wood, and make the grill panel for it, and tune it so that you'd have more or less bass, with tuning ports. You could do those things. You could build a crossover network to separate the frequencies among the speakers, like the bass, the mid-range, and the tweeter speakers. You could build all kinds of interesting things. But today, I don't see many people doing anything like that.
It's not encouraged.
Right.
You seem to be a little bit of a freak if you have one of these sorts of hobbies. And it's like this, even if you think that you're not technically minded, okay? Here's another example of engineering, but it's at a much more basic level. On my farm, I do a type of farming called permaculture, okay? And what I do is I go out and I do shovel therapy, which is like tractor therapy, except I don't have a tractor, I have a shovel.
I got to tell you.
I have a spade or I have a rake and I have a fork.
Yeah, that shovel therapy, that's pretty tough work. Yeah.
Gets you to thinking and it keeps you strong. We'll talk about that some more in a moment.
Well, my mom used to listen to a broadcaster whose name was Carlton Fredericks, and he did a 30-year stint on the radio. He was syndicated, and he would talk about health and nutrition, and a lot of what he said was absolutely right. And he was on the radio in the days before call-in talk radio. And one day I heard him say on the air that he got a letter from one of his listeners. And the letter asked him how he felt about exercise, because he would talk about supplements and, vitamins and those kinds of things. But he said, well, whenever I get the urge to exercise, I lie down until it goes away. Now, here's a guy who was preaching, nutrition, eating the right foods and taking the right supplements, and he died at 77 years old. He happened to not think that exercise was important. And the reason I mention that is because shovel therapy is extreme exercise. Anyone who has mixed concrete and used a hoe and a shovel knows how hard it is and how physically demanding it is. It's much, much harder than pressing keys on a keyboard. Much harder.
It is.
Let's talk about shovel therapy and what you mean by it.
Okay. Now, with permaculture, it involves a great deal of digging holes. You've got to dig holes for fence posts, for, strainer posts, for, you have to dig trenches for, there's a type of trench called a swale. It means a trench on contour to stop water just flowing off your land, so that it stops the water on contour in the landscape and gives it a chance to soak in and replenish the water table. And a lot of the, time the slopes that you might be working on might be too steep to get a bobcat up or whatever. Not around here, but, bobcats are expensive. I don't have my own bobcat, and it's expensive for me to hire one. So often I just get out there with my spade and I dig trenches on the landscape and I make terraces on the landscape. By terraces, if you think of, in China and in Japan, of how they have rice paddies and they are formed up the side of the hills. and there's a slight slope on this landscape of maybe around about 10 degrees. Okay? So it's enough of a slope to install some terraces. And you notice that when they put the terraces in, the whole landscape comes to life. And I noticed that, and I thought, well, I'll have to do that. And so I put some terrace gardens in, and it enables me to grow things that I probably wouldn't be able to grow here otherwise. And it also gives me a place to dispose of animal manure. Because when you have horses, and when you have dogs, and when you have chickens, and when you have any farm animal, it's going to be producing manure. Okay, and you have to have somewhere to put that manure where it's actually going to compost in a proper way, and it's not going to contaminate the water table. And terraces are a very good way of recycling the manure because the nutrients get held within the landscape. That all involves shovel therapy. And in each terrace bed might only be 2 or 3 square metres of garden. But in that 2 or 3 square metres, I'll be able to plant things like figs, oranges, lemons, grapefruit trees, things like that I probably, because the soil here is so pathetically poor, there's no way, if you dug a hole and put an orange tree in, it would wither and die, okay, because it's granite soil, it's got eucalyptus trees growing all across the landscape, it's absolutely pathetic. But by engaging in some shovel therapy and some landscape engineering, I can grow things that I wouldn't be able to otherwise grow. And I suppose that would be my hobby.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just growing stuff.
Yeah.
And
Guineith and I'll be right back.
A better place.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit more about terracing. Guineith and I have been talking about terraces. And in agriculture, a terrace is land that is sloped, but it's been reshaped into a series of flat surfaces, kind of like steps, and it allows you to grow more effectively. And that's what a terrace is. Now, they're not just used in Australia. They're used all over the world. Vietnam, Pakistan, the Incas used them, Indonesia, all over, Italy, China, everywhere you can think of, they're used. So what it does is it reduces the speed at which water flows off the land so that more water can soak into the land and thus improve, well, obviously the moisture content, but the growing potential. That's what it does. Now, it's also a pain in the neck. We have some terraces on our farm, and I would really like to be able to take the shortcut between point A and point B, but I can't always do that because...
You can't do that with terraces. You have to walk around the edge of them. Otherwise, you'll compact them.
And then there's another component to it. I believe it was the government that assisted farmers in the terracing technology right after World War II here in Missouri. And a lot of the farms have these terraces. But neglected farms, here's what happens. On the edge of the terrace, they grow trees. And then, saplings pop up, and then they grow into these large trees.
You can't really do that. You grow trees in the terrace, not on the bank of the terrace. Because the trees fall down, and that's the end of your terrace.
Right, and what happened here in our neck of the woods in Missouri is trees have been, because you can't easily mow the hill of the terrace, farmers neglected that area. And now there are trees along the terraces, which is really not the best design as I can see it. So that's what we have here. It looks kind of nice, but it's an impediment to what we're trying to do. So, but we're going to have to leave it because the trees are, half a century old.
Yeah. Once they get that big, especially if they're a tree that tends to live for centuries, it's probably best to leave them in place, because you definitely are going to ruin the terrace and have a lot of terrace. You can repair it fairly easily with, but it's the slope, probably you wouldn't be able to get your bobcat up there so easily.
Right.
So
and
once again, it would be shovel therapy.
Yeah, and I believe the way I believe the way they were built on our farm and the neighboring farms was
probably with
bulldozers. Yeah, bulldozers, that kind of thing. Yeah, I don't think they were done by hand. They're just too many tons of earth.
Yeah.
I had a question for you.
Yep.
There are a number of people who are saying unkind things about President Donald Trump and other politicians. But I've never heard anyone mention or write anything negative about Charles, Prince of Wales, or Elizabeth II, Queen of the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand.
Oh, dear. Prince Charles, I have a very low opinion of, mostly because he's actually proud of the fact that he is the direct descendant of Vlad Dracul, who is one of the most brutal royals of all history. And he's the one who Count Dracula was directly based on. Him and his first cousin, Elizabeth Bathory, were a truly bloodthirsty pair. They literally, especially Elizabeth Bathory, I think that if Prince Charles is the reincarnation of Vlad Dracul, which he seems to think he is, then Camilla is probably the reincarnation of Elizabeth Bathory. Okay, she was a lady in the day. She quite literally used to bathe in the blood of virgins because she used to think that would maintain her youth, and she used to stand her servants in the garden and pour cold water over them in the middle of a Transylvanian winter night and watch them turn into, quote, pretty ice sculptures. That's a quote from Elizabeth Bathory. And Prince Charles has actually bought Dracula's castle in Transylvania and spends a large portion of his year there. He's a disgusting piece of humanity, and I pray to God that he never becomes the king. Regarding the Queen, I think that she's had... I think that the biggest mistake of her life was that she married Prince Philip. I don't think she really recognized what he was, who he was, before she married him. But Prince Philip is also an evil piece of work. His mother was a Greek princess, and basically after he became the Duke of Edinburgh, his mother, I'll be diplomatic here, went to live in a Greek monastery, nunnery. And Prince Philip, she would repeatedly write to her son, asking him and then begging him to come and visit her in the abbey, in the nunnery. And never once in his whole life did Prince Philip, after he became the Duke of Edinburgh, go and visit his mother in the monastery. And this was over a period of 30 or 40 years. That's a man who is a disgusting piece of work, to never, ever, 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 ever go and visit, to have all the wealth and all the power and all the money in the whole world, and to never even go and see his own mother. And do you know something? That's even aside from all the pedophilia. for the child sacrifice and all the rest of it, which I'm sure will come out in the wash eventually. Okay. But there's rumours enough of it, and I don't have to repeat them here. But I think that it was the biggest mistake of Princess Elizabeth's life, who became Queen Elizabeth when she married Prince Philip. Why
is it that never a negative word is said? I mean, other than what you've said, I've never heard a negative word about Queen Elizabeth II, nor Prince Charles. Why is it that we don't hear it? Is there a media? Is there? I think
that they keep a fairly firm handle on what is said in the mother country. I think that it's not that they threaten; it's just that they don't support media outlets that tend to say a lot of negative things against the royal family. But
so are you saying it's
blowing back
about
on them now because of the pedophile scandals that are erupting these days to do with the BBC?
Okay. Are you saying that it's about money and there's a flow of money that can be diverted away from those who might say negative things about the royal family?
I've got absolutely no evidence of that, but that's probably the case.
Okay. All right.
It's all speculation, okay? So I don't know anything, but I'm a chess player. I play chess. And if I was in their shoes and doing the sort of disgusting things that they do, and if I had as much power and as much money as what they had, and if I had no morals like what they seem to have, then probably that's what I would do. If I were in their shoes, had their amount of money, had their amount of power, and had their low moral and ethical standards, then that's what I would do. And bear in mind, our family historically is not an enemy of the royal family, okay? I don't hate the Queen. My grandmother was actually close personal friends with the Queen Mother. She used to go over to the Queen Mother's place and have cups of tea. Mm-hmm. This was Pop's wife. Used to go over to the Queen Mother's place before she was married and used to go and have afternoon tea with, she was Her Royal Highness at the time. She was the... she was the wife of the King's brother, which I think would be Her Royal Highness at the time. But, I'm not an enemy of the royal family, but some of the things that they've been doing and the behaviour that they have been engaging in has been flat out inexcusable. And if any one of us did what they've been doing, we'd be arrested, and we ought to be. If we had been doing, which we don't do that sort of behaviour because it's wrong. It's flat out wrong. But I think that is why that you never hear anything about it, is because of money and because of power. And people that speak out do not get supported. And that's been the way it's been for a long time until very recently.
When we come back, can you tell us what the Queen does? What does the Queen do? I mean, other than protect the monarchy, what does she do? We'll be right back. Guineith Isaacs is with us, and if you'd like more information about her, there's a link on the website, usaprepares.com, usaprepares.com. Click on the instructors tab, and there's a link right to Guineith there. Guineith, I've attended a number of times a convention in military artifacts, and over the years I would see some of the same people over and over again, and it was a convention that was well attended, the largest in the country, United States, and there was a gentleman who flew in from England, and we'd have sometimes we'd have a bite to eat together, after the convention in the evening, and it'd be a a group of us that would go out convention after convention. We get a bite to eat together, and we became friends, international friends. And he was from England, and I said, so tell me, what does the Queen do? And his response was, well, she's the Queen. And I'd say, okay, what does she do? Well, she's the Queen. And I say, okay, what does she do? Well, she's the Queen. That's as much information as I could get, and that might be as much information as he had. Now, he is certainly a pretty bright guy, but at the same time,
he didn't know what she did.
Right. What does the Queen do?
Exactly what she does. One of her official titles, she has a great number of them, but one of them is Defender of the Realm, and that sums it up in a nutshell. The reason what makes Britain great is because Britain has British common law. Okay? The reason why America is great is because America has American common law. And if you scratch the surface of American common law, you get British common law. That's what American common law is based on. Okay? All the fundamental principles of British common law are also the fundamental principles of American common law. And unfortunately, I think that this is not to personally offend Her Majesty, but I think that she has failed in her role as Defender of the Realm, especially in the last 10 or 20 years, because British common law throughout the former British Empire, throughout the Commonwealth, has pretty well gone down the toilet. It absolutely has. Where is our right in the Commonwealth anymore to bear arms? Where is our right to private property? Where is our right of habeas corpus, the right of the privacy of the person? You know, where is our freedom of speech? You know, the reason why I'm on American radio doing radio broadcasts and not in Australia doing radio broadcasts is because here in Australia, journalists get locked up for speaking out about terrible things that are happening in this country. And even speaking on American radio, I'm still taking a chance, but hey, I've got to speak out, you know, about the things that are happening here, you know. That's, you know, in the United States, you would call that the First Amendment, right?
Yeah.
The right to freedom of the press, the right to speak out. That comes, the Americans, George Washington and them didn't just make that up. They were going off British common law. And they were not taking to the British anything that was foreign to the British. They were simply holding their own law up to them as a mirror and saying, see this? This is what we want. This is what we want here. This is your own law, and you're not keeping to it. And admittedly, you know, King George was not British. He was German. He didn't know anything about British common law. But her job is to uphold, her primary job, her first job is to uphold British common law.
Very quickly.
Unfortunately, I think she's failed on that count.
Very quickly. The name Windsor, that was picked, right?
Yep.
They picked the name Windsor.
Her name is actually Sack Coburg Gotha.
Very good. Gwyneth, thank you so much for being with us today.